مشاهدينا، مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. تتسع فضيحة الفساد التي تجتاح البرلمان الأوروبي وتزداد حدتها يوما بعد يوم، حيث تضيف تقارير وسائل الإعلام والاعترافات المسربة وتصريحات المتحدية من المحامين الجنائيين تقلبات وتحولات جديدة للقصة المعقدة أساسا. عموما، للمزيد من المتابعة تنضم إلينا البروفيسور دانييلا إيريرا، مؤلفة كتاب البرلمان الأوروبي وعلاقاته الدولية. بروفيسور دانييلا، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
الادعاء البلجيكي يحقق في اتهامات بالكسب غير المشروع في البرلمان الأوروبي، إلى أين وصلت التحقيقات؟
Well, the Parliament has immediately started an action in order to fight against corruption and illicit lobbying inside the Parliament itself. There was established a special committee to run in parallel with a probe by the Belgian prosecutor, and there was a very recent meeting in order to go in parallel to this investigation. So obviously, for example, the Parliament has started the procedure for removing legal protection to the people who have been involved, and also the Parliament Legal Affairs Committee will give, I think it just started in these days, to these two members of Parliament a chance to defend themselves, to say their piece in order to complete this lawmaker. But the process is going to be quite slow.
فضيحة بهذا المستوى، ما الذي تقوله عن مصداقية الاتحاد الأوروبي؟
Well, it's very hard to say that because obviously it's very unfortunate that something like this happens in one of the most representative institutions of the EU, which is the European Parliament. It's the only one institution which is elected by European citizens. But at the same time, we need to understand that this is due to the action of some individuals. It's obviously a very big thing, and there are several individuals involved, but individuals that were also in having very relevant duties within the Parliament. But at the same time, it's very hard to say that these can have a huge impact on the credibility of the overall EU system, which is made obviously of other institutions and other actors. Obviously, this is not very good for the image of the European Parliament. This is not very good for let's say, for the sense of democracy and transparency. It is something very, very strong to be obviously to be tackled. So we can say that it has affected some kind of, to some extent, EU credibility, but obviously this cannot totally affect the system as a whole.
ما هو الخط الفاصل بين اللوبينج واستخدام جماعات الضغط للتأثير على قرارات البرلمان والفساد؟ هل المنطقة قد تكون رمادية أحيانا؟
Well, I know that there is a dividing line between the huge literature of political science on lobbies and lobbying as an action and the perception of public opinion. Obviously, when we talk about lobbies and lobbying as an action, we immediately refer to an act of pressure which is made in order to have a personal gain. So this is something that exists in the reality, but at the same time we need to consider two different things. On the one hand, we have corruption, which at this level is institutional corruption. So the use of power, any kind of power, for obtaining a personal gain, which can be sound, can affect any institution, and this is institutional corruption. And also on the other hand, we need to consider that there are several lobbies operating at the EU level. Many lobbies are doing a great job because they are representing interests. They represent various categories. So obviously the biggest ones are very much related to big affairs or very likely to fall into conflicts of interest. So obviously in some cases there is a gray area which can be perceived in different ways. Obviously it can be perceived as an area in which it's very difficult to distinguish relations between politicians or members of institutions, members of the Commission, members of other EU institutions and lobbies, which may produce very good results. Or sometimes this may also produce a very bad results. So the gray area exists, and it can be, let's say, analyzed in both dimensions, both positive and negative. But still, we need to consider that lobbying has been one of the most important tools that non-state actors, which are obviously people, citizens, categories which are not dealing with political parties, can be represented at such a high level, and the only way sometimes to bring interests into the policy making system.
هل أضاءت قطر جيت على قضايا أخرى جدلية في البرلمان الأوروبي؟ يتم الحديث الآن مثلا عن صفقة فايزر.
Yeah, absolutely. This is right. Obviously, the Qatar Gate has opened to a very cautious approach towards what the Parliament is doing. This is sure, and we can say that firstly, there will be more attention, let's say, on the procedures, on how, also the different steps that are part of the policy making procedure and everything which happens within the Parliament. Obviously, other scandals may, I mean, not necessarily scandals, but other things have already happened within the Parliament. As you were referring to the Pfizer deal, I would consider them more than a conflict of interest rather than a real scandal. And so conflicts of interest may happen, may be more frequent than we can expect. Obviously, we don't expect conflicts of interest. We don't expect scandals at this level, but we don't expect conflicts of interest either. But at the same time, we also have to consider that the European Parliament within the EU system is managing several issues, have different powers, although the Council is the most important actor, obviously, institution, obviously. But the more policy fields the Parliament is managing, the easier would be for its members to risk, let's say, the conflicts of interest. So this may happen. This is not a justification, obviously. So this only means that the Parliament should be much more careful and look more on what is happening inside itself.
للبناء على ذلك وللتعامل بحذر أكثر، ما الاستراتيجية لمكافحة الفساد بعد قطر جيت؟ رفع الحصانة عن البرلمانيين المتورطين مثلاً؟
Yeah, there were so many debates about this anti-corruption strategy because the EU is very likely to produce issues strategies in order to tackle the most important thing that have arisen. But in this specific case, it can be quite difficult to understand if a comprehensive strategy can be produced. So, for example, there was an extraordinary meeting of the Constitutional Affairs Committee during which the members of the European Parliament have adopted a decision to amend the European Parliament rules of procedures in order to allow more action and more steps towards let's say, a strategy to strengthen justice and the fight against corruption. So there are less constraints. Obviously, there was also a huge debate on for example, the possibility of lifting the immunity of members of parliament involved. Obviously, it would be quite difficult. Once this decision, after this meeting, once, let's say, this strategy would be approved, the rule of procedure will also include a procedure fully aligned with the responsibilities of the European public prosecutors. But at the same time, these people, the people who have been involved in Qatargate, have been totally and immediately removed from their position. So I believe that lifting immunity would be very difficult because of what members of parliament are doing and what they are involved in. But if this strategy would allow the immediate removal of any person who is involved in scandals or conflicts of interest that can affect or can impact the overall work of the European Parliament, that could be a good sign of efficiency. So for now, for example, the European Parliament is currently working without any, it's working because these people have been removed. And so the most important things are in the process of being fixed because this prosecution will take more time. So it will be obviously required.
كيف سيؤثر التحقيق على العلاقات بين بروكسل والدوحة والرباط؟ هل العقوبات مطروحة هنا؟
I'm not underestimating the Qatargate, obviously, which is a very serious affair. But at the same time, we know very well that the first approach within the EU is to consider extreme measures as a last resort. So diplomacy first, dialogue first. So it is very likely that relations with Qatar and Morocco will be managed in a diplomatic way and to fix, let's say, the most relevant issues, and obviously sanctions can be considered only when there is no space for dialogue. But I think that there is space for dialogue, and dialogue will prevail in the end because interests in common are very relevant.
بالحديث عن المصالح، كيف تتوقعين رد فعل قطر والمغرب وهما تنفيان التهمة؟
Well, obviously, we may all understand reactions of these countries because nobody would like to be involved in an affair like this. So we still have to remember that there are several individuals involved. So obviously, as individuals who are members of the European Parliament cannot impact on the institution as a whole. We may say the same for the country. So we may say that obviously individuals who have been involved may be found, and individual responsibility will probably be prosecuted on both parts. But I don't expect, obviously I cannot predict exactly what will happen, but we may expect that diplomatic relations will prevail. And obviously there are so many connections, as you mentioned, gas, obviously. So that there is a reciprocal need to continue having a relationship. So this does not mean that, more attentions towards, transparency or in the relations, or to be more careful to those people who are involved, especially at highest levels. This may happen, and this can only be an improvement for both parts.
حتى أفهم منك أكثر، هل يمكن رمي مسؤولية القضية أو الجرم في هذه الحالة على الأشخاص وليس الدول والمؤسسات؟
No, actually, we cannot say that it was just a mistake of one individual. So what I'm saying is that there was a mistake by one individual who was in charge of the European Parliament and who was covering very important duties because he was entrusted with very, very specific tasks. Obviously, if I do a mistake as an individual, I can try to fix, and there's no real issue. But if I am a prime minister, for example, or if I am a minister, or even if I am members of a parliament, obviously, and if I make a mistake, obviously the institution or the country which I represent is affected. What I'm trying to say is that obviously the fact that things like this happened obviously will produce an impact, but this impact cannot completely destroy the, let's say, the set of relationships that have been built and developed over the years among countries and among the European Union and its partners, with the involvement of several people and several actors. So obviously this will have an impact that this may change, for example, procedures it may, let's say, decrease a little bit the sense of confidence. So this sense of confidence should be fixed a little bit, because but we know that diplomacy is also based on confidence, so trust. This is very important among partners. So this would be probably also important to see. But at the same time, relations between the EU and its partners will continue to be guaranteed in the end, because these relations also produce an impact on other policy fields and on the life of millions of people, and this cannot be simply underestimated. The affair obviously exists, and the president of the parliament, so Mrs. Metsola, for example, has already declared that there was a huge mistake and that the European Parliament failed to monitor. And it is something that should be considered as well.
باعتقادك هل ستلقي قطر جيت بظلالها على الانتخابات المقبلة للبرلمان المقررة في غضون 18 شهراً؟
It may have an impact, of course, because the European elections also depend on a set of quite complicated political relations between families of political parties. So this is not just a simple reproduction of all political parties that exist in EU countries at the European level. So all political parties are grouped into families of political parties, and these are the families that participate to the elections, and so let's say that elections will have an impact on the coalition. So I think that firstly, political parties will be much more careful during elections, in these elections of their own representatives, or those people who run for elections. And at the same time, this may also have an impact on how coalitions will manage relations among them and also within them. So if you ask me whether the political results will completely change, this is very unlikely, because obviously transparency, accountability, trust are very important and will continue to be important. But as I said before, the European Parliament is very active in several policy fields. So there are several other factors that have an impact on the elections. So big families won't change. Probably relations among big families may have a change, or relations among coalitions of parties.
بروفيسور دانييلا إيريرا، شكرا للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.